Thank you for coming today. We have a pretty full agenda, and we've got 120 slides for 90 minutes. So I will take questions in the question and answer tab, but probably won't get to them until the end, unless I see from the schedule that I have that we're a little bit ahead of time. So this is encoding for newbies and optimizers. So there's going to be, the plan was to do something for people who are totally new to h.264 encoding to get them up to speed with some of the compatibility and related quality controls, and also to have something in there towards the end on how to optimize the quality of your encoding ladders and specifically, the top and most important files in your encoding ladder. So first we're going to go through configuration basics, and a lot of this, I'm sure there's some experienced people on the compression side out in the audience, and a lot of this stuff will be basic, but I just wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page. We'll go through configuration basics, resolution, data rate, and frame rate. Then we'll look at video quality metrics. I mean, everything I do is metric based from a configuration perspective, so I want you guys to understand what they are, how to compute them, and what they do. And then we'll look at encoding with h.264. There's a compatibility side and a quality side. And then we'll look at bitrate control techniques. Again, that's pretty basic. A lot of people know, constant and variable bitrate encoding. Also going to look at CRF because I think that's critical to what we're going to learn towards the end, where we look at the optimization side. Then we'll get to CRF encoding, constant rate factor encoding, and capped constant rate factor encoding. And then we'll look at techniques you can use to build your encoding ladder that are based on CRF, and then we'll look at real briefly at per title encoding, what that is and what your options are there. So on a promotional note, okay. Okay, I don't. Okay, on a promotional note, all the lessons that we're going to cover today are excerpted from my course on Streaming Media 101, Technical Onboarding for Streaming Media Professionals. Just want to take the opportunity to announce that both BitMoven and Dolby are using this course to onboard new employees in the streaming space, and you can check out the press releases in the bit.ly URLs here. One more configuration notice, and that's it. So configuration basics are encoding options you use every file. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I think most people know it, and that's data rate, resolution, and frame rate, and then we'll define an encoding ladder because obviously that's our end goal for a lot of the work we're going to be doing. So data rate is something you set for video and audio for every file that you encode. Here's the video data rate setting in, I don't understand. Here's the bitrate setting in the Adobe Media Encoder, and video, obviously data rate is the most important factor in terms of overall quality. The higher the data rate, the better the quality, but the harder the file is to deliver. You're going to set data rate for audio as well as video. For most audio, anything going beyond 120 kilobits per second is going to be not heard from, okay, I'm getting, anything above 128 kilobits per second isn't going to be perceived by the listener. So typically I stick with 128 and below. The only exception might be if you're producing a concert or something where the audio really is a big part of the overall quality of the production. Sorry, I keep getting messages from GoToWebinar that screen sharing's paused. Okay, video resolution, that's the height and width of the video in the file, typically in terms of pixels. It's a significant determinant of quality of overall quality, because the bigger the picture, the more data you have to supply in order for that to be to look good. The more pixels, the harder it is to compress, the more data you need to look good. And that's why a lot of times you see files downsampled in the lower rungs of the encoding ladder. So here we're saying, we're going from 720 by 480 to 640 by 360, and that's reducing the pixels in the file by 75%, making it a lot easier to encode. Frame rate is something you set typically when you shoot the video. It's also set when you encode the video, and typically you encode at the rate that you shot the video at, unless you get down into the lower rungs of the encoding ladder, and this is an encoding ladder here. And what an encoding ladder does is it's a collection of files used by all adaptive bitrate technologies, whether HLS or DASH or even some of the older ones. And it's designed with different resolutions, different data rates, and different frame rates to deliver the best possible experience to viewers watching on a range of platforms and a range of connection speeds. So that's what an encoding ladder does, and this is what a typical encoding ladder looks like. Okay, brief introduction to objective quality metrics. I use metrics a lot, and I've used them a lot for reasons that'll become clear in a second. In this section, you learn what they are, why we need them. I'm going to use VMAF mostly in this presentation, but I also want to discuss SSIMPLUS because it's a very high quality metric, and also PSNR because it's something that most people have heard of. So what are objective quality metrics? They're mathematical formulas that attempt to predict how human eyes would rate the video, except they're faster and automatable. When I say attempt to, I mean, none of these metrics are infallible. You know, some of them can have, some of them, you know, to a high degree, they should match how humans will perceive the video. And we'll see some examples of when that works and when that doesn't work, but they're not infallible. So I use them, but as you'll see in this presentation, I check pretty much everything that I use. I don't go by the number itself. I look at the frames that make up the number and look at the videos that look at the videos in real time to see if the differences that we see in the metric manifest as real significant differences that the viewer might notice. But they're faster and automatable, which is good. And then we've covered, you know, some of the more common ones. Why do we need them? We've got a lot of encoding decisions to make, some of which we're going to cover in this presentation, some we're not. But you know, I don't like making them based upon just eyeballing videos because it's very time consuming, and I think it's not repeatable, and it's not always, you know, it's not typically not accurate. All of these encoding decisions have trade-offs, and the objective quality metrics let us mathematically measure the quality of that trade-off. And objective quality metrics are used by companies like Netflix to drive their per title encoding technology. It's useful, you know, my entire book, which I'll mention in a second, video encoding by the numbers. When I say by the numbers, it means that every recommendation I make is dictated by metric results. And you'll see a lot of that in this presentation. And you know, before metrics, this is what I used to do. I used to encode the file, and then I used to put them side by side in a Premiere Pro timeline and try and look for the differences throughout the file. And obviously that's, you know, as I said before, it's error prone, it's time consuming, and it typically doesn't repeat. You can often see different things, different times you go through the file. And with objective quality metrics, I have the ability to produce, you know, charts like this, and we'll see a lot of those in this presentations, where red is typically bad, green is typically good, and orange in this case is, you know, second to the worst. And I get a graph like this that lets me understand how the metrics score through the entire length of the file, and I can go in and actually look at the individual frames. So I see this big drop in green here. That tells me there's a problem in that frame. I click over here, see frame, and I can view the frame. Not only the frame in the compressed file, but also the frame in the original file, and I can compare two files that way. So I'm not going by the score alone. I'm going by the score plus what I see from the frames themselves. And this is a tool from SimWave, and it's the VOD monitor, and it gives me the ability to get a graph like this and also to view the frames themselves in this view, which is the frame itself, and this view, which is a representation of the artifacts in the frame, and it's very useful for identifying where the problems are. So I went from here to here and really never looked back. So with objective quality metrics, you get more data. You can run a whole lot more tests than you could by trying to eyeball the file. I think you get better data because there's more of it and it's repeatable. And you know, again, that's where I base most of my consulting, most of my writing, and most of the work that I do in compression space uses objective quality metrics to decide what's good, what's bad, what's better. Looking at the individual metrics, VMAF is a metric invented by Netflix. It combines 4 existing metrics, and it's fused with a artificial intelligence support vector machine. Scores range from 0 to 100 per video frame, with 100 being identical to the reference video, and frame scores are averaged to produce to compute a single score. And you'll see some score results in a second. And this is, if I use the Moscow State University tool, which is the tool that I favor for VMAF calculations, this is the results file I get. So it shows me the source file. I can compare 2 files at the same time, and then I see the mean of the 2 files. So this is VMAF mean, harmonic mean, which takes into account the variations in the file, lowest quality frame, and that's important because I want to know when I choose an option if it's going to increase the risk of transient quality problems, and we'll see a lot of that in this presentation. So again, one score, which is something you get from FFmpeg, is useful, but unless you dig beneath the numbers, you could be missing a lot, and we'll see a lot of examples of that throughout the course. So the lowest frame score is transient problems potentially. Highest frame score, I don't use that much, and this is the frame location if you want to go look at the frames. And then standard deviation of the scores over the length of the file, and then the variance, which is standard deviation squared. So this is what I get from the Moscow State University tool. It's not what I get from FFmpeg or VMAF Master, which is Netflix's tool. I just want to point out there's 3 models for VMAF, meaning they're predicting the score on different devices. The default model is for a 1080p screen, viewing distance of 3x the screen height. There's also a phone model and a 4K model. And all of the scores that I'm presenting today are the default model. So I'm not going to go into phone model or 4K model. A couple of things about VMAF. First is 93 is the top level quality target. And here's why. There was a white paper written by Real Networks CTO, Risa Razul, called VMAF Reproducibility, Validating a Perceptual Practical Video Quality Metric. He analyzed 4K 2D videos, and he found that with a VMAF score of 93, the compressed file is either indistinguishable from the original or with a noticeable but not annoying distortion. And from my perspective, that means when I'm choosing the data rate for my top quality target, I'm going to use a VMAF score of 93, because that tells me that the video file should be of reasonably good quality, or even better than that. It's either going to be indistinguishable or with some differences, but nothing annoying. So, and here's the URL for that white paper. So here's how I work with VMAF. The range of scores is 0 to 100. The top run target is typically this 93 score. I want to encode my files so that they're above the 93 level. And anything higher than 93 is a waste. I mean, if you achieve a 98, if you've already got quality that's indistinguishable from the original at 93, then adding data rate to produce something higher is just a waste. And the score should map to subjective evaluation. 0 to 20 is bad, 20 to 40 is poor, 40 to 60 is fair, 60 to 80 is good, and 80 to 100 is excellent. So if you get a score of 40 to 60, you would assume that viewers would find that video fair. If the score is 20 to 40, you would assume they would rate that video as poor. Another good thing about VMAF is that 6 VMAF points is a just noticeable difference. So if I see a VMAF score of 91 versus 92, I understand that very, very few people would actually notice the difference between the output quality there. So 6 VMAF points is something that I rely on a lot. And it helps me here. So, I'm looking at this file, which is the haunted house video. And if I increase from 1 megabit to 2 megabit per second, I'm doubling the bit rate, but I'm gaining about 12 VMAF points, which tells me that's, 2 just noticeable differences. Everybody who sees that video is going to notice that. On the other hand, if I go from 4 megabytes per second to 6 megabytes per second in the Big Buck Bunny file, not only am I above 93, I'm really only boosting VMAF by maybe a half a point or 1 point. So this tells me that this investment in bitrate is not worthwhile, but this investment in bitrate is worthwhile. What is SSIMPLUS? SSIMPLUS is another metric. It's invented by the inventor of SSIM, which is one of the oldest and most respected metrics. I don't. And it's an advancement of SSIM, obviously, and where SSIM was a still image metric, SIMPLUS is a video metric. So it looks at motion as well as the still frame quality. Okay, I don't really understand why this is happening. Okay, and like VMAF, SIMPLUS shows a strong correlation with subjective evaluations, and the scores also map to easily understandable subjective ratings. I'll show you what that means in a second. It also supports multiple resolutions, making the metrics easy to compute, and it supports multiple frame rates, which is something VMAF doesn't. That's important. With VMAF, you can't compare the difference between a 60 frame per second file and a 30 frame per second file, which is important when you've got 60 frame source and you're wondering what the better alternative is lower in the encoding ladder. Can't do that with VMAF, you can't do that with SIMPLUS. And it also supports some HDR formats, and as far as I know, VMAF doesn't do that yet. And it includes multiple device profiles so that you can, we saw the 3 profiles for VMAF. SIMPLUS has many, many more than that. You'll see a bunch in a second. And it's also very fast. VMAF is much slower than real time, even when it's multi-threaded. It's kind of a pain to use that way. But SIMPLUS in most applications is going to be faster than real time. So it's a useful metric if you can get access to it. Unfortunately, it's not open source, so you're going to have to buy one of the products from SimWave. I talked about mapping to subjective ratings. 0 to 20 is bad, 20 to 40 is poor, 40 to 60 is fair, and 60 to 80 is good, 80 to 100 is excellent. There is no concept of just noticeable difference that I'm aware of. There is no concept of the 93 score as being the target. Anything in the 80 to 100 range should be excellent, but there's no 93 equivalent. And then here's the device models where SIMPLUS, SIMPLUS, I get SIMPLUS and SimWave, the company manufactured, sometimes mixed up. But the SIMPLUS device models, as we see here, if you want to look and see how your video appears on a economy class LCD panel, you can do that. You can't do that with VMAP. Okay, my Dropbox is, I think it's saving my file, whatever it is, it's messing it up. Give me a sec. Okay, Dropbox kept saving my file and putting up a message that it was saving my file, which kept stopping the screen share. So hopefully that'll stop now. So back to the SIMPLUS device models. All scores are reported both for generic device. You can have one score that you compare, every time you analyze a file, but you also get many more device models. And you see again, airline LCD panels, different smartphones, different tablets, different monitors, 1080p and 4K television sets. And this lets you assess the quality on any and all devices that are relevant to your business. And that allows you to customize the encoding ladders by the specific device if that's what you want to do. And then what about PSNR? It's an older, better known metric. It's much more accessible. It's fast. You can get it pretty much FFmpeg. A lot of other tools provide it. It's still cited by Facebook and Netflix and many researchers just because everybody knows it. I think from a video perspective, PSNR is certainly not as good as VMAF or SIMPLUS, but I think most people are familiar with it, so they continue to use it. I find it okay in the context of a 1080p video, but as you go down into the encoding ladder, I just don't find it useful. I don't think it comprehends scaling very effectively. I don't think it comprehends the the concept of an encoding ladder very effectively. And then here's how to compute them. You know, VMAF, the Moscow State University tool I've referenced a couple of times. A couple of articles I wrote, computing VMAF with FFmpeg on Windows. That's how I do it when I'm not using Moscow State University tool. There's also a Netflix tool that I call VMAF Master. There's an article here you can read on that. SSIMPLUS is available on the SimWave VOD monitor and some other products that they sell. And then PSNR, you can easily compute an FFmpeg. Okay, I like the SimPlus tool and the Moscow State University tool because it gives me a visual tool. And I've talked about this a couple of times, but you know, this lets me identify potential problem frames and then I can visualize them. You know, and over one score doesn't do me any good. Even looking here, I see a quality difference. If that's at a black transition or a fade that no viewer would notice, I want to know that. I don't even want, you know, low frame score is something that's good to have, but you also need the ability to actually view the files themselves. And that's why I prefer SimPlus, and that's why I prefer VMAF. So this is the SimWave SimPlus VOD monitor, and this is the Moscow State University tool. You'll see more of this over the course of the presentation. FFmpeg is great for summary numbers, but it's not great for any kind of analysis. And in this session, it's going to be mostly VMAF because it's open source and accessible to all, but I do use SimPlus a lot in my consulting practice and in some of the writing that I do. Okay, so that gets us to h.264 encoding. We're going to spend a brief minute on what h.264 is, then we're going to look at the compatibility related settings, profiles, levels, and entropy encoding, and then we'll look at the performance related settings. So what is h.264? It's adopted by the International Standards Organization and the ITU, and this is MPEG over here, this is the ITU over here, and it has two names because, you know, this is one development path, this is another development path, and they kind of joined in 2002 for h.264. So the ITU calls it ABC, and the ISO calls it h.264. Or do I have that? So it has two names. I want to point out that there are multiple h.264 codecs because h.264 is a standard. Many companies can develop codecs for that standard. FFmpeg uses the x.264 h.264 codec, which is probably the best known and widely considered to be the best widely available h.264 encoder. Elemental has their own codec. Adobe uses the main concept codec, and Beamer has their own codec, which they distribute via licensing. So the critical h.264 encoding parameters. Some parameters apply to all h.264 codecs. When I talk about profiles, levels, and entropy coding, anytime you encode to h.264, whether it's with the Elemental tool or the Adobe Media Encoder or FFmpeg or Handbrake, you're going to be able to adjust usually at least profiles and levels. There are some that are codec specific. So later in the presentation, we're going to talk about presets. And presets are x.264's way of balancing encoding time and quality. Now, most h.264 codecs have presets. Main concept has them, Elemental has them, but they're not going to be called the same things as the x.264 presets, and they're not going to work the same way. So we've got some parameters that are available for any time you encode to h.264, and some that are h.264 codec specific. And I just wanted to cover audio really quickly. Anytime you encode with h.264, there's a good chance you're going to encode to AAC, and there are three AAC variants: AAC-LC, low complexity, AAC plus, and AAC plus V2 or EAAC plus. And this is a summary graph, and what we see here is the bit rate, and what we see here is the quality level. And this basically shows us that the quality of the AAC1 and the AAC2 here are better than AAC-LC in lower data rates, but once you get up to 128 kilobits per second, which is what I'm recommending you use anyway, the quality is about the same. So I recommend that you just use AAC-LC anytime that you're going to be 128 kilobits per second or above, which is where most people stay at this point. So now on to the profiles, levels, and entropy coding. And these are the compatibility aspects of H.264 encoding. So what are profiles and why do they exist? Profiles enable different encoding techniques to balance decoding complexity. So here's the baseline, main, and high profiles. And these are the encoding tools that are available in each one of these profiles. So we see that the high profile has many more encoding tools available than the baseline. Why did the spec include baseline, main, and high? Because baseline uses the fewest tools, so you can decode a baseline encoded stream a lot easier than you can a high profile encoded stream. Then early iPods or early iPhones and early iPod touches only supported baseline encoded video, and you'll see that that was very important in how you had to encode back then, although it's much less important now because devices now pretty much all support the high profile. So high uses more encoding tools than baseline, which should mean it delivers better quality, but it also means it's harder to decode. But again, over the last, I would say 6 to 8 years, every device that's been shipped supports the high profile through certainly 1080p. So while 12 years ago, we had to worry about playing on an iPhone 1 or an iPad 1, a lot of companies don't worry about that any longer. And we'll cover that in more detail in a moment. And again, it's the most critical compatibility related setting that you set with H.264. You can't play high encoded video on a device that's only capable of baseline profile. What about the quality? So we'll be spending a lot of time with test clips that I used in my book, Video Encoding by the Numbers. And I have 10 files. There were 8 files in the book. I added 2 sports clips, football and soccer. And why did I look at multiple files? Why didn't I just do this one file? Because every file encodes differently. And if you figure out what's best for a talking head clip, that doesn't mean it's going to work for an animation, doesn't mean it's going to work for a football clip, doesn't mean it's going to work for any other type of clip. And the and that's what I went through with my book, Encoding by the Numbers. I should have pointed this out at the start. I apologize for not doing that. You should be able to download the presentation handout via control on the right of your screen. So look at the downloads and everything. It's been uploaded, so you should be able to get that now. Sorry I didn't mention that when I started. But it is available for download right now. Anyway, the test clips, there's 1 movie clip, Tears of Steel, there's 2 animations, there's 2 general purpose, there's a music video and an advertisement, there's 1 talking head, a screen cam, which is a Camtasia screen cam, which is pretty idiosyncratic. Obviously, it's gonna encode differently than a football game. And then there's a tutorial, which is PowerPoint and video. So pretty much what you're seeing now, where we have a big PowerPoint screen and a small talking head on the right. And I encoded all these files again because I wanted to see how they were different and come up with recommendations for video files that people were commonly encoding. I mean, if you're encoding inside a business, you care about how PowerPoint encodes. You don't really want to apply movie settings to your PowerPoint files. Okay, so we're talking about H.264 profiles, and this is one of the charts. It's very much like the chart you'll see a lot of in this presentation. They're also in the book. They're also in my courses. These are the profiles. These are the test files here. This is the difference between baseline and main, difference between main and high, and then the total difference between baseline and high. So what we see, red is always the worst, green is always the best. So we see that, yes, the high profile is much better. On the other hand, we see that there's only a 2.31% difference between baseline and high. So if you're looking for a huge difference by jumping up in terms of your encoding or by switching from the baseline to high, you're not going to see it. Certainly not at 1080p. You may see it in lower rungs of the encoding ladder. And this is just a graphic representation of that. We see, the scores here are 90 going up to 96, but if, the increase here is from around 90 to 92, refer back to that 6 VMAF points equals a just noticeable difference. Few viewers would notice this difference, and we see the same kind of dynamic here. High profile is always better, but it's not such a huge difference. And then low frame quality. I look at low frame quality as a measure of transient qualities, and this is transient quality issues. And here we're starting to see some difference. VMAF score is obviously here is the score of the lowest frame in the encoding ladder, or lowest frame in this particular file, and we see some pretty significant maximum deltas. So with Big Buck Bunny, there's almost a 13-point difference, which tells me that you're going to notice the difference between those two files. Sintel, the popular animation, there's over a one just noticeable difference at 6.88, and the Haunted production, which is a movie-like production, we're seeing also a big difference there. So there is going to be a difference, not so much in terms of overall quality, but in terms of low frame quality, the potential for transient quality issues, there's going to be a significant difference. In terms of encoding time, we care about encoding time because that's what we spend our money on if you're running your encoding farm. And baseline is the fastest, but for some reason, this makes no sense because there are more tools being used. The high profile is faster than the main. So it costs you a little bit more to encode using the main profile than the baseline, but it costs you less to encode with the high profile. Now, this is what we care about, how to use profiles in an encoding ladder. And let's do a brief history lesson. And this is one of the original encoding ladders recommended by Apple in TechNote TN2224, which they took down a couple years ago, but was probably the most useful TechNote ever produced for video streamers. And what Apple recommended here was customizing the profile for different targets. And you see why here, because the iPod Touch 2 version 4 could only play baseline profile. And same thing for some of the original iPhones. Of course, these are devices that are really, really old and are probably not in service anymore in those big numbers. Back in 2017, Apple replaced TechNote TN2224 with their HLS encoding recommendations, and they said expect all devices to play the high profile all the way through the encoding ladder. So they basically said, don't worry about legacy devices, just use the high profile. On the other hand, if you're producing for Android support is bifurcated, meaning the Android software only supports the baseline profile, but every Android device typically is going to have h.264 hardware-based encode or decoding, and that's going to include the high profile. So Google's recommendations for Android encoding are either baseline profile or main profile for Android 6.0 or later. But you'd have to assume that any device that's out there, like the Apple devices, should be able to play the high profile in hardware, even if it can't play it in software. So we looked at the overall difference in quality at 1080p. What's that look like in an encoding ladder? And so here we have a talking head encoding ladder and 1080p all the way down to 180p, and we see baseline, main, and high. And again, the baseline encoded clip is the lowest quality. Some main is better, but on average, the high profile is better. So baseline's the worst, high's the best, and the difference is greatest in the lowest rungs. So we see a difference of between 1 and almost 2 here. Now, 2 is not a just noticeable difference, but it's something that will get your attention. It's a significant, it's something you would think some viewers may in fact notice. On the other hand, most viewers watch the top 3 rungs for most applications that I've seen. And the overall difference between main and high is tiny. So you shouldn't have any issue for a low motion file if you're doing talk shows or similar shows, choosing between main and high. So the synthesis is the baseline and the low rung penalizes viewers on newer devices. If I'm on my iPhone 10, I'm looking at one of these lower rungs because I'm on a 3G connection, I'm going to get worse quality if you produce the baseline file than you would if you use the high profile here. Now with a football clip, this is a high motion clip, we see much bigger differences. So baseline is again the worst. Again, here's our encoding ladder, here's baseline, main, and high, and then here's the difference between baseline and high, baseline, main, and high. And the difference is bigger here than it is down here, which was kind of a surprise. The deltas in the lower rungs are still reasonably significant, but again, most viewers are watching these. So you definitely, and the delta between the main and high profile went from 0.07 to 0.95. Still not a huge deal, but creeping up there. And synthesizing here, again, we're penalizing viewers watching on newer devices if we use baseline profile here. And we certainly don't want to use baseline profile here because there's a significant difference over a just noticeable difference. So here's kind of the decision flow, the way I would go through it, and this is all based on your log files. You know, if you're serving lots of older devices, it's one thing. If you're not, then just, you know, use the high profile for all the rungs on your encoding ladder. That's what Apple recommends. If you are, check the playback on the lower rungs. How many viewers are actually watching those rungs? In a lot of applications I've seen, it's insignificant, maybe less than 1%, less than 2%. And if there's not high playback, then a lot of viewers aren't going to be looking at those lower rung on the ladder clips anyway. So if you do encode them on the baseline, you're not going to reduce QoE for many viewers. It's cheaper approach because you're only encoding with one encoding ladder. There's minimal quality of experience loss, and pretty much all devices that can play main can play the high, which is why I'm just leaving out main profile clips here. On the other hand, if there is high playback on the lower rungs, if you're distributing to a largely mobile audience and the 3 or 4 lowest rungs are being consumed by a lot of different viewers, then you may want to consider multiple ladders, meaning one ladder that's just high profile, interrogate the viewer when they connect, and then send them a different M3U8 file. If they can play all high profile clips, or send them the lower quality M3U8 if they can't. But what I'm seeing is, you know, very few publishers tend to create different ladders for different targets. I think most companies now are using one encoding ladder, and they're either ignoring baseline profile altogether, or they're using the baseline profile on 1 or 2 of the lower rungs, and that's pretty much it. And the obvious justification there is that you want to retain viewers on legacy devices, even if the lower rung quality suffers some. Okay, so that's profiles. What about levels? Levels set further limits on how the video can be produced and consumed. So up here we see the specs for the iPhone 7. I have an iPhone 10 and I'm 2 generations behind. So this device can play high profile level 4.2. And if you go to Wikipedia, you see that level 4.2 is, 2K at 60 frames per second, up to 50 megabits per second, up to 62 megabits per second for the high profile. So that's more than you'd ever even try and distribute to an iPhone or any device for 1080p video for that matter. So typically levels are only a concern for much older devices. If you're using the baseline profile, then go to your log file, figure out what those devices are, check their levels, and then make sure that the videos that you encode are below the specs for that level. And then entropy coding is how the compressed data is packed. 12 years ago, there was some concern that CABAC was a little bit harder to encode and therefore slowed encoding speed or decoding speed. On any device these days, or even a 10-year-old device, that's not going to be a huge deal. Use CABC if you're encoding with the baseline profile, which is the only technique available. Use CABLC with I'm sorry, I got that reversed. CABLC for baseline, CABAC for the main and high profiles. So that's the compatibility side. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Okay, choosing an X.264 preset. What's a preset? How to choose the best one. We'll look at both quality and encoding time, and then we'll look at how to apply that data. So presets are simple ways to balance multiple encoding parameters in terms of encoding speed versus encoding quality. And this analysis is going to be X.264 presets. So if you're encoding with the Adobe Media Encoder or another tool that doesn't use X.264, this may not be so important, except that most tools are going to have some type of preset, and you're going to want to understand the quality encoding time trade-off. So, what we see here are the presets in the x.264 and x.265 codecs, and the medium preset is the default. If you don't set a preset, you encode using the medium preset. Okay, so how does quality average? You know, this is the typical chart. We've got the files here, we've got the presets up here, we see the total delta here, and obviously the ultra-fast preset is the fastest and does give us the lowest quality in most of the files and on overall average. Interestingly, very slow gives us the highest quality on all files, meaning placebo, which takes significantly longer to encode, doesn't provide any additional benefit. So if you're using x.264 with a placebo preset, you can save significant time with no drop in quality by jumping to very slow. Red is the lowest quality, green is the highest, and again, very slow is the highest score, not placebo. But there's only a 6% spread in terms of average quality between the best and the worst. Now let's look at low frame quality. Again, we see ultra fast and super fast are in the red here. This probably need to check that, but this just seems like an idiosyncratic error here. For the most part, we see low frame quality is going to be best and slower, very slow, or placebo. But there's, instead of the 6% difference, there's a 33% difference, which means while the overall quality may not be that significantly different with the lower quality presets here, there may be significant transient quality issues associated with those presets. And that's what we see here. So here, red is ultra fast, green is medium, and this is the VMAF score of both clips over the duration of the clip. And this top is the entire file, and this bottom portion is the shaded region here. So I zoomed in here, and what we see are significant differences between the ultra fast and the medium, both up here and down here. And these are times where you click show frame, and then you'd say, hey, can I actually see the difference? And if you could, then you play the video in real time and see if you could see the difference there. And these would be noticeable to the viewer. So I would never use ultra fast, even though the average quality isn't that terrible, for VOD video. You might use it for live because that's the only way to produce your full encoding ladder, but you wouldn't use it for VOD. And then if you check faster versus medium, and you'll see why faster is important in a second, we see very little difference between the quality of the medium clip and the faster clip. So the low frame differential shouldn't be that great. But faster here will let you cut encoding time by 66% with very little noticeable quality difference, either in overall score or in low frame score. So, and this is where I'm plotting the average scores of the different presets here, and these are average for the 8 files, and this is the overall quality, and this is the low frame quality. So up here, these are the average scores themselves. These are not percentages. We'll look at percentages in a second. So we see, you know, all these scores are, you know, here we're at 94.52, here we're at 92.99. You might consider using these presets because the difference isn't all that significant from here. On the other hand, if you look at low frame quality, you would say, holy cow, I don't want to use any of these because I'm going to have transient quality issues my viewers may notice. It makes, you know, very little sense to go beyond medium because you're getting a significant chunk of the overall quality, and the low frame quality risk isn't that significant. And it never seems to make sense to go beyond very slow because this score is actually slightly lower and this is slightly lower. Now let's look at the time side. Again, these are all the presets. This is the encoding time in seconds for the 1080p files. And what we see is that it takes, on average, 213 seconds to encode to placebo, 11 seconds to encode to ultra fast. And here I'm measuring the percentage of overall time. So I can produce the ultra fast file in 5% of the time it takes me to produce the placebo. I can produce the very slow file in 31% of the time it takes to produce the placebo. So again, if you go from placebo to very slow, you'll triple your encoding capacity and actually get better quality to boot. Now this plot is scored on a percentage of overall. So here we see the percentage of overall time. this shows percentage of overall quality because that was the only way I could plot both time and low frame and average quality on the same graph. And what we see here is this is encoding time, this is low frame quality, this is average quality. And again, average quality is okay, but there are risks of transient quality issues there. Again, this is the first acceptable VOD preset, and as compared to medium, it basically cuts your encoding time close to 50%. And if you're at capacity and are faced with buying some new machines, then that could be significant. The quality difference isn't that significant. Again, it makes very little sense to go beyond medium. And if encoding time doesn't matter, if you just want to know or produce the absolute best quality, then I would go very slow, but I would never go to the placebo. So again, this is the lowest quality preset I would use for VOD. And I would probably never go beyond medium because I just think if we go from medium to very slow, you're roughly you're slowing your encoding time by 2x or 2.5x, which means you're reducing your encoding capacity by 2.5x for very, very tiny gains in both overall score and low frame score. So faster is best, of the x.264 presets, faster is best for those seeking maximum throughput. Makes very little sense to go beyond medium. Very slow is the best. Placebo never makes sense. And again, if you're using another encoder, typically they're going to offer some kind of quality encoding time toggle. And before you choose what you're going to use in your encoding farm, understand the trade-offs. Do an analysis like this where you measure encoding time on one side, average quality for VMAF or SSIMPLUS on the other, and also low frame quality because of the transient issues that we saw, and then make your own determination for that particular encoder. Okay, bitrate control. Most people know this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. This is where we cover VBR and CBR. We're going to look at overall and transient quality. The difference between overall scores aren't that significant, but transient quality is an issue with CBR. And then look at how both techniques affect deliverability. So this is a CBR file, and we see a file has 5 different sequences. Some are high motion here, some are low motion here, and the CBR file doesn't care. You can tell how old this slide is if it's 600 kilobits per second. So it's going to apply one data rate maintained throughout the entire file, irrespective of the complexity or the motion in the underlying video footage. And this is what it looks like. And what we see here is, and this is a tool called Bitrate Viewer, and this is the CBR encoded file, and this faint blue line here is the average bit rate. And we see it doesn't change significantly over the 1-minute file. The average bit rate is 600 kilobits per second. Now a VBR file, so the VBR stream would change the data rate according to the complexity of the video. So this is low motion, moderate motion, high motion over here. We should see the lowest motion here, the highest motion here, and that's what we see in the average data rate here. So what VBR does is vary the data rate according to scene complexity, but the overall average bit rate is around the same. In fact, in this example, CBR is higher than VBR by 7 kilobits per second, not a huge deal. When you produce CBR, the typical uses are going to be live. You typically wouldn't use CBR for VOD for reasons we'll see in a moment, or if you're streaming to very constrained lower bitrate connections like 3G. And typically it's single pass, but there are some applications for 2-pass. So this is in the Adobe Media Encoder. First you would choose your encoding technique, and then you would choose your target bitrate, and then that's how you do CBR encoding. VBR, the typical uses are VOD streaming or mezzanine file creation. Typically it's 2 passes, but I've also seen single pass VBR, and I've also seen 3-pass VBR. And again, first you choose VBR, and then you choose the target, which is the 4 megabit per second here, and then the maximum, which is the 6 megabit per second file. So what you're telling your encoder here is, overall, I want the bit rate to be 4 megabits per second, and I don't want you to go higher than 6 megabits per second anywhere in the file. So with CBR, you input one number, just your target bit rate. With VBR, you input two numbers, your target and your maximum, and sometimes with some encoders, your minimum. Although very, very few encoders. I haven't seen that in an encoder in a while. So how much better quality is CBR than VBR? And these are average quality numbers. And this is 200% constrained VBR, meaning 4 megabit per second target, 8 megabit per second maximum. This is 150% VBR, what we saw in the Adobe Meaning Encoder, 4 megabit per second target, 6 megabit per second maximum. And this is 110% VBR, where it's 4 megabits, 4.4 maximum. And this is 2-pass CBR, 1-pass VBR. Green is always good, red's always bad. So 200% constrained VBR does deliver the best overall quality, but the overall difference for overall score is only 0.58. So the difference between the top score and the lowest score is 0.58%. Or I'm sorry, it's 0.58 VMAF points, which is really not that much. It's certainly not, it's nowhere close to the 6 megabit per second or 6 VMAF threshold, so it's not something that you would notice. What about transient issues? I've kind of already defined what's going on here, but red is the first file. This is the CBR file. Green is the second, 200% constrained VBR. The graph is the VMAF score over the duration of the file. This is the VMAF score, and this is the length of the file. Top graph is the entire file. This is down here is the selected section, and then if I want to see a particular frame, I just click this. So I would go in and I'd highlight this area here, click down here, and then click to look at the frames and see what the difference is. So this is the source file, this is the constrained VBR file, and this is the CBR file. So you see a very, very noticeable difference in this particular application. And the bottom line on quality is the overall quality difference is minimal, but CBR has the potential for many more transient quality issues, and typically constrained VBR, either 110% to 200%, avoids those. Now, what about the deliverability side? VBR can create files that have very significant movement in the data rate. So to kind of illustrate that, I created a test file that's got 30 seconds of talking head, 30 seconds of ballet, and then I encoded that using the different techniques. And this is the CBR file, and we see very, very little change in the overall average bit rate. This is the VBR file, and we see, here's the talking head, here's the dancing, here's the talking head, here's the dancing. And something like this, if you're working on a constrained connection, could cause deliverability problems. And again, the overall data rate is pretty simple. Is pretty similar, but the maximum here, the peak is 5,300. Here, the peak is 8,500. So this file could cause issues if you try and deliver it over constrained connections. So this is why we typically limit VBR to certain maximums. And over the years, it's gone from when I wrote the book Video Encoding by the Numbers back in 2016, I was kind of stuck on 110% constrained VBR. Now it feels like the entire world has gone to 200% constrained VBR. And the typical top bit rate that most people are delivering to in the homes, at least, is so high that it really, even swings like this don't matter. And with 4G and 5G coming, a lot of the same is true for mobile connections. But the bottom line is, if you use VBR, you have to apply a limit, and typically that limit's going to be at most 200% constrained VBR. So CBR is constant bit rate. It's easy to deliver, but it's the lowest overall quality by a little bit, and it does have transient quality issues. The best application is live streaming. You always want to use CBR for live streaming because you really do need to control the data rates through the entire pipeline. VBR, it gives you the best overall quality. Again, it's just by a little, but it avoids most of the transient quality problems we see with CBR. And the negative is, on some connections, it can cause deliverability issues. The best application is VOD. At this point, most VOD encoding, 10 years ago, there were still some producers using CBR. When I wrote the book, it was about half and half back in 2016. And now I think most VOD producers are using VOD or some version of per title encoding. We'll get to that in a few minutes, that has a very VBR-like data rate pattern. Okay, let's look at constant rate factor. And this is where, a lot of that was background. And at this point, we're getting into some interesting stuff on the optimization side. We'll look at what CRF encoding is, how to encode with CRF, and then we'll look at Capped CRF. So what is constant rate factor encoding? It's an encoding mode in x.264, x.265, and VP9. And it adjusts the data rate to achieve the target quality. And it uses a quality range of between 1 and 51 with lower levels giving you higher quality. So this is the typical representation of an encoding string that you might see in FFmpeg or even the Adobe Media Encoder. Basically, you just input a file and then BV or bitrate video, you choose a bitrate. And the encoder, whether it's FFmpeg or the Adobe Media Encoder, will deliver a file that's 5 megabit per second in data rate, but the quality will vary. I mean, if it's a soccer match, the quality could be pretty poor. If it's a talking head, the quality could be excellent, but the quality could have been excellent at 2 megabit per second. So this is the typical data rate driven encode. And what CRF does is you input the same input file, and then you ask for a quality level. Here I'm asking for quality level CRF 23. And what the encoder does here is it doesn't vary the quality, it does pretty consistent quality, but it varies the bit rate up and down to keep that quality. So it's quality centric as opposed to data rate centric. So again, VBR and CBR encode to hit the specified bit rate, and it adjusts quality to hit that bit rate. CRF delivers the specified quality level and varies the bit rate to achieve that. And basically that means you can't use CRF for streaming because you don't have a data rate limit. You need your file to be 5 megabits per second because that's the limit you define for that rung on the encoding ladder. Now let's look at capped CRF encoding. So capped CRF encoding combines CRF encoding with the data rate cap, and it delivers the specified quality with a maximum bit rate. So you're basically setting a cap where the quality level can vary here depending on the content in the clip, but it can never go above the cap. And let me just, and this is interesting because now we're starting to move into what's called per title encoding. So per title encoding changes how you encode the file based upon scene complexity. And we're going to get to that. We're going to get to products that are in the per title category at the end of this presentation. But Capped CRF is a kind of per title technology. It was used well before Netflix invented per title encoding because it varies the compression based upon the content in the video file. So it's really cool from that perspective. And it's used by some pretty big companies. So Vimeo encodes their files using Capped CRF. JW Player, which is a major online video platform and player developer, uses Capped CRF as their encoding technique. So this is a very cool technique a lot of people have been using for a lot of years, even before per title encoding was invented by Netflix. So how do you do it? Basically, and again, some encoding tools are going to give you access to this, some encoding tools won't. This is an x.264 feature. You don't have this if you use AWS Elemental Media Convert. They have their own form of this QVBR, which works similarly, but it's not going to work exactly like what you're seeing here. So what we see is we see the CRF, which is what we did in the example before, but we also set the maximum rate and the buffer size. And these are the commands here. And again, here are the CRF values. We're basically saying, hey, FFmpeg, encode this file to a CRF value of 20, or CRF quality of 22, but don't exceed a max rate of 3,500 kilobits per second, and don't exceed a buffer size of 7 megabits per second. And here's Capped CRF in action. So this is the CRF file, this is the Capped CRF file. And here we see the CRF file, the peak data rate is 4455. So we see much higher peaks here. And when we set the max data rate here at 3,500, we see that FFmpeg gave us a top bit rate of around 3541. So basically we've accomplished the mission. We've capped the bit rate of that file, which allows us to use CRF. So again, CRF is, the bit rate is going to cap the bit rate because you need it. You need the ability to cap that. If the file's easy to compress, it's going to be down here. If the file's hard to compress, it's going to be up here. It might even bump against the top bit rate, but the quality is going to be as good as if you encoded with VBR at that data rate. Or there are some, I don't want to say as good because it's going to be a good on average, but there are some transient quality issues that you may see with Capped CRF. So this is Syntel, and again, this is the Moscow State University tool. This is the VMAF score over the duration of the file, and I highlighted this region here, and this shows that VBR is up here, Capped CRF is down here. What's it look like in the file? This is VBR, this is Capped CRF. It's noticeable difference, but it's hard to say that some viewer would look at that and really notice it if they're watching it in real time. The key thing here is it's a 1 or 2 frame difference. So few viewers will notice that, but we see the same pattern. This is the Freedom clip, it's a music video. So this is the VBR file. This is the Capped CRF file. We see some blockiness here. That's also going to be a second or two down here. So tough to say if a viewer is going to notice that. And then this is the football clip. And we see significant differences throughout the clip, but they're just not that visible. This is VBR, this is Capped CRF, VBR, Capped CRF. You're just not seeing a lot of difference that the viewer would notice, particularly because it's very transient. So the benefits are, it's a single pass, so it's very efficient. Basically, if you went from VBR, 2-pass VBR to Capped CRF, you're going to lose an encoding pass, and you probably are going to cut encoding speed or increase encoding speed and increase capacity by between 30 and 40%. And it's a very highly effective per title encoding tool that you can do yourself. The negatives are the transient quality issues that we saw and the bit rate variability within the file. But again, there's some pretty interesting companies using this, and they're finding those negatives not a reason not to do it. I think if you're interested in implementing per title, I think Capped CRF is an interesting technology, although certainly there are other technologies you might want to consider, and we'll get to that towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so a lot of that was just to familiarize you with what CRF was, and you know what VMAF is now, and all that. So now we're getting to the question, how do you set the data rate for the top file in your encoding ladder? Because once you know the data rate for the top file of your encoding ladder, then it's pretty easy to create the encoding ladder beneath that. And we're going to use CRF to help us do that. So what is the ceiling? The ceiling is the lowest full resolution data rate that delivers acceptable quality. Now, acceptable quality, as you guys remember, is typically defined as somewhere between 93 and 95 on the VMAF scale. And how do we find that ceiling? We covered CRF. We'll take a quick look at that again. We'll look at the correlation between CRF and VMAF, and then we'll move on to choosing the resolutions. So here's 10 files now. So I added the football and soccer file because I wanted to see how they performed as well. And I computed the data rate with CRF 25. So you recall, basically it's input file, CRF 25, output file. I encoded 10 files, and these are the results. You see the data rate varies between 726 here for the tutorial clip, and that's PowerPoint and Talking Head, to 7 megabits per second here. So it's a variation of over 1,000%, or 10x. And that basically tells you that if you're building a single encoding ladder and you're using it to encode both the tutorial clip and the football clip, you're wasting a heck of a lot of bandwidth with the tutorial clip, because whatever encoder you use, if you ask for 7 megabits per second, it's going to give you 7 megabits per second, even if it's not necessary for that quality. The VMAF score might be 99, but you're spending money to deliver 7 megabits per second where 700K would have given an acceptable result. And then we measure the VMAF rating, and the values here range from 90 to 98. And so really taking a step back, we're trying to, how do you predict the score that's good enough? And what I'm suggesting is that CRF, in this case 25, if you encode as CRF 25, you're going to get a data rate that is how the limit that you should use to encode that file, and that should give you a VMAF score of between 93 and 95. So I encoded 10 files, and what we see is the average VMAF score with CRF 25 was 94.87, and only one file was below the target. So this is a pretty good effective rate for any kind of video encoding technology. We'll see in a second. YouTube they have an artificial intelligence-based per title encoding method, and they didn't do any better than CRF did. And the standard deviation is 2.16, which indicates very little variability in these scores. Meaning, if you use CRF 25 to predict the quality, you're going to get a rating that's pretty close to around 94.87. So kind of what I said before about the encoding ladder waste, and as we saw when we started looking at VMAF in the first place, if you get to 93 or above, that should be sufficient. And CRF 25 with X.264 typically delivers at least VMAF 93. So what I'm trying to say, for the third time, is encode with CRF at a value of 25. You should get around 94 to 95 VMAF points. So let's kind of do a reality check on that with YouTube. So what I did here is I uploaded all the files to YouTube, and then I downloaded the 1080p file, and I measured both the data rate and the VMAF score. And again, YouTube uses artificial intelligence-based encoding, which basically uses a bunch of different techniques to ascertain the complexity of the clips that they're encoding. So what we see is with CRF 25, the overall, or the bit rates for these files here was very, very similar. And it diverged significantly for the two sports clips. And on average, it's very, very close, which tells me that CRF 25 is pretty accurate, even compared to an artificial intelligence-based technique used by YouTube. Now, we saw the big differences for sports, but overall the average is close. What we see here is the VMAF side of this. This is data rate, this is VMAF. And what we're seeing here is a lot more consistency with CRF 25 until we get to the sports clips. And red is YouTube, blue is CRF 25. And we see here where CRF 25 produced 7 megabits per second and YouTube was down at 5 megabits per second. YouTube made the mistake because their VMAF score is way too low. So again, I think CRF 25 does very well as compared to YouTube, and is reasonably consistent. And what's the point? And this is again, this is CRF 25, this is YouTube, this is the delta between the two, and overall, there were some pretty big data rate swings, but overall, YouTube was around 282 kilobits per second lower, but 2 VMAF points behind FFmpeg with the X.264 codec. So what's the point? CRF 25 aligns with VMAF 93. CRF 25 also aligns with YouTube's base quality metric, which is artificially intelligence-based. So again, if you want to figure out what the top data rate needs to be for the files that you're encoding, CRF 25 is a great way to do that. So how do you choose the individual data rate for the rungs? We've decided we know what the ceiling is. The ceiling's 4.6 megabits per second or 5 or whatever it is. Once you know the math, once you know the highest, the rest is just simple math. So choose the score that delivers VMAF 93 or 93 to 95. Then choose the lowest bit rate that you want, whether it's 200 or 300 kilobits per second. And then you want to fill in the blanks so they're between 150 and 150% or 200% apart. So you don't want to go from 1 megabit per second to 10 megabits per second. You want to go from 1 megabit per second to 1.5 to 2 megabits per second. And that's kind of an Apple rule of thumb. If the files are too far apart, you could leave viewers stranded at this rate because they don't have bandwidth to get this one. It's better to include intermediate rates so they can get those there. You don't want them too close together because it increases your encoding cost and there won't be that much visual difference between the files. So Apple basically said back in TechNote TM2224, keep them between 1.5 and 2x apart. So this is the top rate, this is the lowest rate, and then if you just multiply this number by 0.6, you get to these values, which are around 1.6, 1.7 apart. So use CRF 25 to figure out the top rate, and then use this math to figure out what the individual rungs should use. Now, how can you use these techniques? You can use Capped CRF as a per title encoding technique. And again, the high level problem we're facing is, how do you figure out the top data rate for your files to get good enough quality? And how do you vary the encoding technique for the different files that you encode, assuming there's some variation? If you're producing talk shows, you can very definitely save money as compared to sports shows if you use a lower data rate in your encoding ladder. So how do we do that? We can use Capped CRF, and we've already learned how to do that. We've already seen the companies who are doing it. And then we can use category-specific encoding. And what worked here were separate ladders for talk shows and sitcoms for a major OTT producer. So a company came to me and said, we're at 8 megabits per second, what can we do? And we did this analysis for some of their talk shows, and we got VMAF scores of 94 to 95 with low motion, daytime shows that they had. And we switched to that encoding ladder. They saved from a maximum of 5 megabits per second to 8 megabits per second, and nobody noticed the difference. On the other hand, for some of their higher motion shows, some of their feature shows, some of their sports, they had to encode at 8 megabits per second to get to 93 to 95. Also work with the training company where they need separate ladders. If they're producing PowerPoint or screen cam videos and also talking head training videos and other videos, then you definitely want different encoding ladders for those different techniques, because you can get very efficient with these types of synthetic files. And also an online bike video. They had videos that you use when working out. These were 1080p videos of racing scenes. Those needed to be 1080p at pretty high bit rates. On the other hand, their yoga videos that were in a simple studio, you can encode those as 720p at much lower data rates and still achieve the 93 to 95 target VMAF score. So if you've got a diversity of files there, it should be pretty usable. What didn't work, separate ladders for different kind of movies. So if you have action movies versus rom-coms, there's just too much diversity within a category like that. And separate ladders for animations versus movies. Animations, there's just so much diversity there as well. Cintel versus Big Buck Bunny versus SpongeBob, all very different in complexity. So I couldn't come up with a difference in encoding ladder that would encode those effectively every time. So the procedure here is, what I'm suggesting is you do a CRF 25 encode, and basically you can use FFmpeg to do it, you can use Handbrake to do it, which is a free downloadable tool available for Mac and Windows. Then you check the data rate in media info, and in this case it was 3272, and then you choose a ladder preset. And I'm suggesting that you create different encoding ladders for different bit rates achieved through the CRF 25. So again, we encoded with CRF 25. This bit rate was 3.272. So I'm going to use the 3 megabit per second ladder, and I'm going to use these data rates and these resolutions. So that's a pretty simple, if you have low volume operation, you can, if you've got 1 or 2 files a week, you can very easily do this. On the other hand, if you've got a whole lot more files, then you may need to find a solution that's scriptable for you. And then I just wanted to point out, typically you're not going to be in this range unless you have very, very low motion talking head type videos, or you've got synthetic files like PowerPoint and ScreenCam. So most OTT producers are going to be kind of in this range, but if you're doing Office and other similar videos, then you're going to want to include this as well. And I'm suggesting that, bit rates below 150, you probably don't need. If you're encoding for 1 megabit per second target, then the 360p file at 130, you probably don't need, most people are going to be able to retrieve this file as well. And then if you're doing a lot of computer generated graphics, I would suggest that you experiment with higher resolutions in the top rungs. So here we're sticking, 1080p, 720p, 540. Here, for this 3 megabits per second ladder, you're probably going to get better results by keeping higher resolutions here, because most animations and most synthetic files encode at higher quality at higher resolutions. So, and I just wanted to do a brief introduction to per title encoding. We've talked a lot around it. I just want to let you guys know what it is and how to get it. So in the beginning, everyone used TN2224. This is a Beamer. Graphic. TN2224 was the Rosetta Stone that many people use to decipher how to encode video, but it was a single encoding ladder for all your video, and that just didn't make sense. Netflix in 2015 published an article that said, some files encode to high quality at low bit rates. So this is PSNR here, these are bit rates here. Some files got very, very high quality PSNR scores at very low bit rates, and others got very low PSNR scores at very high bit rates. So it made absolutely no sense to encode them both with the same encoding ladder. And Apple handed down per title encoding, and all was good. And basically, per title encoding is systems that adjust data rate, and in some cases resolution and number of rungs in the ladder for complexity and composition. So again, they customize the encoding depending on the content. It basically automates the analysis that we went through, where you run CRF 25 and then use a custom ladder, or what you do with Capped CRF. Capped CRF is a kind of per title encoding. And how to get it, you can do it yourself with Capped CRF or the manual CRF method we looked at a moment ago. A lot of different encoding vendors sell encoders with Capped CRF. Online video platforms, Brightcove has their own version of per title. You can license technology from companies like Beamer or Crunch MediaWorks, and there are multiple cloud vendors that have some form of per title encoding. So, this webinar was about h.264. A lot of companies and a lot of people are considering other codecs at this point. From my perspective, per title encoding should be a much higher priority for most producers as compared to going to HEVC or going to VP9 or going to another codec at this point. I think it's, you've got none of the compatibility risks, and you should achieve very, very significant bit rate reductions and bandwidth savings, assuming that if your encoding ladder is already starting at 4 or 3 megabits per second, you're not going to save a lot. But I think some companies are at 7 or 8 megabits per second because they think that's necessary to achieve the quality targets. Some files it is, some files it's not. And hopefully during this class you learned how to figure out what the top bit rate needs to be. Okay. Questions. If you have any now, ask them. If you don't, I've got a few lined up. Let me cover them. What codecs offer CRF encoding? The codecs I'm aware of are x.265, VP9, and x.265, VP9, and h.264, of course. Let me one more slide or a couple more slides here. I did a lesson on per title encoding. It was part of a presentation I gave at Streaming Media Connect in February. It's a 16-minute video that goes through all the different ways that companies do per title. If it's something that you want to consider, I would recommend this. It's 16 minutes well spent to understand exactly what's happened since Netflix invented per title encoding. If you want to read about it, these are not as, these are all good fundamental foundational articles for per title encoding, but this is something I did in February of this year. This is something that I did for for various times over the past couple of years. Okay, more questions. Okay, let me open this. Okay, this is an extraordinarily small. Okay, somewhere you said that CRF 23 is equal to VMAF 93. Somehow when encode with CRF 23, I'm getting VMAF 98 or 98 scores, 98 or 99 scores. It really, it's going to be content dependent and it's going to be codec dependent. So you may see that with you may see that, I saw 97, 98 with soccer matches, which was kind of surprising, but and I switched from CRF 23 to match VMAF 93 to CRF 25 because I found that better, it came closer to the 93 to 95 range I was targeting. So try CRF 93 and you should get a closer result. Where can you find the additional slides? The slides should be available via download section, about download button on the right of your panel. If you don't find it, then drop me an email at Joser or Jan Ozer, JANOZER at gmail.com, and I'll send you a link, or I'll send you the PDF. I don't know how large it is. What is the recommended profile based upon devices nowadays? I kind of went through that analysis, and what I'm typically hearing is that most older services are they don't want to lose viewers, so they typically don't have an encoding ladder that would exclude them. So most existing services, when they redo their ladder, they keep at least one or two baseline profiles for those users. Maybe they stop at 360p. On the other hand, some of the newer services coming out, I think they're not worried about legacy viewers anymore or older viewers. And I think they just say, well, if you can't play the high profile, you've got a system that's, certainly the premium services. Disney Plus came out and used a technology called CMAF, which is available only on relatively newer devices. And I'm guessing that any device that can play CMAF probably can play the high profile as well. So I think, Disney coming out with a brand new service didn't have to worry about legacy devices. So I think if you're, again, if you're coming out as new, I think you can just go high profile only, unless you're targeting some customers with very old devices. If you're making a change in your encoding ladder, I would check. I went through that analysis. Check your log files. If there's not a lot of older phones or tablets playing your video streams, then it really shouldn't be a problem going to the high profile. If there are, then you may want to consider keeping the baseline profile. I'm working with live sports streaming, ice hockey. I have VBR, CBR, and CQP, which is quality-based like CRF. What do you suggest to use as a bitrate? Okay, so this is an instance where you're delivering a mezzanine file as opposed to a. So the hypothetical is I'm creating a mezzanine file that I'm sending to AWS, and AWS is going to create the encoding ladder there. So here we're going, we've got a different analysis than we do with the whole discussion of CRF 25 and the target of VMAF 93. Typically what I found, soccer is a pretty high motion, probably hard to compress medium. And I would think, I've done some analysis of this, and Marianne, if you can email me at janozer@gmail.com, I'll find the link and send it to you. What I found is, going above, it sounds kind of illogical, but going beyond 10 to 20 megabits per second delivered very little additional value as compared to 100 megabits per second or even ProRes. So I would be surprised if you could see the difference between 20 and 30 megabits per second for that matter. So what you can do is you can, check your mezzanine file that you're sending, do some encodes of that at resolutions that would equal the top rung in your encoding ladder, and see if they're different. And that's what I did in the article that that I'll send you a link to, and you can see what it looks like. What is your take on QVBR with the cap bit rate? QVBR is very much like Capped CRF, and I think AWS Elemental has a new technology. I forget what the name is. I think they actually call it per title, and I think that's a much more interesting technology. You should read the or view the video that I referred to, the per title video, because what you'll see is that QVBR, very much like Capped CRF, it doesn't change the number of rungs in the encoding ladder. So if you start with 5, you end up with 5, and it doesn't change the resolutions. So it can't automatically go from 720p on your encoding ladder to 1080p in your encoding ladder if you're encoding animations. So true per title encoding technologies, like what you get with Brightcove and what you get with the newer technology from AWS Elemental, can do that type of adjustment, and that's much more powerful than just adjusting the data rate within the resolutions of the files that you've already decided to create. So again, most per title encoding technologies today, you upload the file, they decide how many rungs you need, they decide what the resolution of those rungs should be. With Capped CRF, you set the number of rungs and you just kind of fluctuate the data rate within those rungs. QVBR is the same thing, but AWS Elemental has a new technology that gives you the ability to upload the file, and then it comes up with a custom ladder, both in the number of rungs and the resolution. It doesn't work for live though. So QVBR is really good for live, which the other technology doesn't do. Okay, in both VBR and CBR, the bit rate will vary. In CRF, the encoder will attempt to maintain the target quality factor. What variable is VBR measuring when adjusting the bit rate? Great question, I have no idea. You would think it's something CRF-like, but I don't know the answer to that particular question. Can we use per title encoding? Can we use per title encoding for streaming to Twitch? Now, Twitch is another example of where you're sending them a mezzanine file and they're doing the transcoding there. So you send Twitch a 1080p 60 file at 8 megabits per second. They pass that through, but they also create an encoding ladder beneath that, and they're doing the transcoding there. So you don't need to send them per title videos because they're doing that type of analysis themselves. What is the recommended CRF and capped CRF values for VP9? Great questions. I haven't done that work, so I don't have an answer for you. You should be able to, send me an email. Send me an email and I'll send you a link to whatever I have on that. Again, Janos are at gmail.com. Please say again, I heard the Disney video. So Disney, and let me get Disney came out with a new service in the last 6 months. Pretty much everybody's heard about it. It's done very well during the pandemic. They used a technology called VMAF, which is Common Media Application Format. And basically that's one file format that can contain both the manifest files and the encoded files for both Dash and HLS. And it's a great new technique that a lot of companies are considering, but one of the negatives of CMAF is that some older devices don't support it. And specifically, there's a couple of reasons that I won't go into. But so Disney, they said, okay, we can use this technology that saves us a lot of money in terms of online storage and probably some encoding costs, but we're going to exclude certain customers who are watching on very, very old devices. And they made that decision, and I think it was a good one for a new service. It's a very different decision than changing your encoding ladder and all of a sudden having 1,000 people who can't connect to your service. So I think, I think most companies are very reluctant to implement an encoding ladder that will disable some people from watching their streams. Okay. Any idea how VBR actually works? Yeah, good question. I was thinking about that. So how long it averages for calculating the average and such, meaning, when it's 200% constrained, is it every second it's got to be 200% constrained, or every minute, or every 10 minutes? And I don't know the answer to that. I think that's encoder specific. But I don't know the answer. It's a great question. Okay, let me think if there's anything. Okay, that's it. Sorry about the rough start and some of the problems we had during the presentation, but we're out of time and out of questions. So thanks everybody for coming. I plan another webinar in about a month to 6 weeks where we're going to cover same basic issues for X.265 and HEVC, compatibility, different encoding tools. I don't know how much detail we'll get into the Capped CRF side, but another one, if you're new to HEVC encoding, you'll learn basically what you learned about H.264 today. So thanks for coming. Thanks for supporting the Streaming Learning Center, and hope to see you again at a webinar down the road.